I've never done improv personally, like taking an improv class, or I think I was involved in one at a small improv random thing at a conference once. But generally speaking, I really haven't done anything with improv. But they talk about this idea of when you're responding, when one person does something in the improv, your mindset, and sometimes literally what you should say, but definitely your mindset, you want to get into a mindset of yes and, as opposed to a no, or as opposed to even a yes but. So this means, in order for a successful improv scenario to play out, everyone needs to kind of play off of each other. And whatever the scenario is that's given, and whatever the other people that you're working with are doing, you can't just throw up a wall on that, right? If they do something and you're not sure what to do with it, or you don't like the direction it's going, that's not a good mindset to be in. What you're trying to, and those would be the no mindsets, right? Like the idea would be they do something and then you kind of shut it down. That's going to lead to a pretty bad improvisational, scenario. Instead, what you're kind of taught to do is this mindset of yes and. So whatever they do, your job is to kind of accept that, amplify that, and then if you want to move on to something else, that's fine, but it should be in some way related, and it should some way play off of the last thing, and it shouldn't just be a hard cut. It shouldn't just be a hard no. So it's this idea of, a yes and. This is similar advice years ago. I was listening to someone talking about being a good game master for like tabletop role-playing games. And their advice was similar, although slightly different spin. It's kind of a similar situation where you have a group of players, and if you're a bad game master, what typically will happen is someone will say they want to do something, and then you say, no, you can't. And that's very stifling in the game, and also it doesn't lead to anything interesting. And sort of the overall premise of this really was that if you're running a game and, again, it's like a tabletop role-playing game kind of thing. If you're running a game and you have such a set idea of where you're trying to get the story to go, or your characters to go, or whatever, then you shouldn't really be running a game. You should just be writing a story. The whole premise of a game is that other people can interact with it, and these types of games, they can interact with it and they can change it, and you have to kind of work on the fly. So the advice from these folks was to never say no. Instead, you should say a yes, but. So the actions of the players might have consequences. That's the but you should always lead with yes. So these pieces of advice are similar. I think often in life, we get pieces of advice like this, where, not this specific piece of advice, but things like this, where someone comes around to you and says, you should never say no. You should say yes and. Or you should never say no. You should say yes but. Or maybe you've heard this kind of thing professionally, right? Never ask for permission. Always ask for forgiveness. Or never micromanage. Always empower people. Or, never say I can't. Instead, say I'll try, or I'll do it, or, whatever. They're very black and white, right? The advice comes in the form, this pattern comes in the form of never do X, instead always do Y. And I think in a lot of ways, when things are framed this way, they're often running counter to the very thing they're trying to do. Because in theory, the reason these sorts of phrases are around is because typically people do thing A, and this phrase is trying to get you to break out of that box and think a little bit differently and do thing B instead. But I think when you I have a few problems with this, right? Because first of all, if you phrase it like that, then all you're doing is is putting yourself in a different box. Never say no, always say yes and. Okay, well now you're in a new box. And I'm not saying that's a bad advice from an improv level, like especially when, you're first learning to do that, I assume that's very good advice. It's a good rule of thumb. But if you take it to heart too far, right, and you never say no, or if in a work scenario you take advice like never say I can't, instead say, I don't know, whatever professional phrase you've been taught to say instead, you're just in a different box. Sometimes you can't, and you should probably be honest about that. Even other advice, things that I do kind of agree with when you hear things like, oh, you should never micromanage. Yeah, but every now and again, you probably should. Like, it does come up. And I think that this idea of taking these sort of pieces of advice that are so black and white and that are, if you use them correctly, right, if you use them as a rule of thumb, they're very, very helpful. Because probably 95, 98, 99% of the time, you should do things in these ways. But you still are a person of judgment. Like, you still have, presumably, some amount of common sense and judgment that you probably should use in order to make the right decisions. And sometimes the right decision could very well be to do the thing that you're often advised not to. And I would argue that that's where people with really good decision-making capabilities, that's where they shine. It's knowing that, the last 99 times they empowered their team to do a thing. And now this 100th time, this is the thing that now they have to micromanage for whatever reason. Or they generally always look for solutions. And 99 times before, they've looked for, and maybe they haven't succeeded every time, but they've always looked for a solution. And now this is the 100th time. And it's time to, this one you have to say you can't, for whatever reason. Or again, going back to the improv example, the last 99 times you did this, you always said yes and. But now this scenario is the one where you have to say no. For whatever reason. And I think that's where people with really good decision-making and judgment capabilities, that's where they shine. So, the point of this really is just to say, when you hear things that are extreme, and I think we're surrounded by statements that are so black and white. Like, all you got to do is pull up a LinkedIn feed and you'll see it all over the place, telling you to always do something in one direction. And it's just like anything else in life. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but at the very least, don't close yourself off to the thing that they're telling you not to do. Because once in a while, most likely, that will be the correct thing to do, and the thing you need to do, and the thing you should do. And that becomes a chance to really flex your decision making and do something that otherwise, if you take the, whatever advice or rules of thumb to heart so deeply that you never ever consider the alternative, that's where you end up right back in the same spot you were before, just in a different box.